Hello everybody, welcome. My name is Chad, Chad Godfirnon. I'm work for community medical centers and I do database development, generally with Microsoft SQL Server as the back end and Microsoft Access as the front end, and I do some web development as well. I run MySQL at home for a couple of different things, some internal web applications I have. I share my music files with some of my family members, things like that. So I have a little bit of experience using it. I'm by no means a guru, so if along the way anybody here who has had some experience with MySQL has some recommendations or suggestions, please feel free to shout them out. So with that, let's get started. All right. What this presentation is going to cover. In brief, it's going to cover just a real quick summary of what MySQL is. I'm going to go over quickly the process for installing MySQL on a couple of well-known Linux distributions. We'll go over some simple administrative and security things you should do the first time you install, right after you install MySQL. And then we'll set up a user, talk about why users are important. Connecting to and using the database, we're going to connect to it from a local shell. I'll tell you how you can connect to it over the shell, over the network. And then I'll show you PHP MyAdmin, which is a PHP application that simplifies administering MySQL Server. Talk about the basics of SQL, which is really the core of most relational database management systems that are out there today. Oracle, Microsoft, MySQL, anything else you think of uses SQL or structured query language to interact with the data. We'll create a couple databases and tables, talk about what to do when creating a table. Talk briefly about backups. MySQL has a couple of integrated tools for backing up your data, which is pretty important. And they also have a couple tools for bringing your database up to the point where it failed. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then last, if we have time, we'll talk about data normalization, which is really more of a topic that you would cover on an intro to databases class. I mean, you can spend a whole 2 or 3 college course days talking about data normalization. It's really key to making your applications work fast and efficiently and make your data understandable perhaps by someone who comes in to maintain your code after you leave. Any questions so far? All right, if you have any during the presentation, just go ahead and shout them out. All right. What is MySQL? MySQL is a relational database management system. Very much like some of the other ones you may know of, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server. It's set up in such a way to allow tables of data to be related to one another in the most logical way, using as little space as possible, trying to make it fast and efficient. True relational database management systems are multi-user and multi-threaded, which MySQL is. You can have more than one user connecting to the MySQL server. It scales across multiple servers, so you can have a server farm that will be housing your data. It's multi-threaded, so it's aware of multiple CPUs, multiple CPU cores, multi-core CPUs, so it's already designed to run fast and efficiently on the hardware that comes out. It's developed and owned by MySQL AB, which is a company that is dual headquartered in Sweden and the United States, actually in Cupertino in the US. MySQL, the company, provides a MySQL database. It's a little different than other open source projects you may be aware of. A lot of open source projects, the project is out there, maybe the name is owned by somebody or the certain proprietary parts are owned by somebody. MySQL has done what they call multiple licensing on MySQL Server. So they are the primary developers, but they do take patches from the open source community. They release everything they create as open source, but if you're a company that doesn't want to deal with some of the requirements of the GPL, you can purchase a commercial license from MySQL and be able to run it and integrate it with applications without having to provide source code to whatever you integrate it with. There's also a third license that it's released under called the GPL with its free/Libre open source software acceptance clause. What that is there are certain open source licenses that are not compatible with the GPL, but are still open source. So they'll allow you to create applications that are compatible with a different open source license. So it's very, very customizable to the application you need to apply for. Plus, with a commercial license, you can get vendor support, which is nice if your boss doesn't want to put something out there that's open source because they're afraid that it's going to go away. It's the most well-known, if not the most feature complete, of the open source database servers. Other ones are PostgreSQL, Firebird. There's even SQLite, which really isn't multi-user, but it's out there. And what's a unique part of MySQL is that it's created with a pluggable table architecture. When you install Microsoft Office or Microsoft SQL Server, you have the Microsoft table format. Now you can link and import data from other database servers, but all the data is stored in Microsoft's proprietary format. MySQL allows different types of database tables to be plugged in that have different features. Some have maybe the ability to support different data types, etc. So enough about that. But one important part of that is that when you create tables in MySQL, you need to know which type of table you're creating, because if you create a table that doesn't support, say, transactions, then you won't be able to do transactions in your database. You won't be able to roll data back if one of your transactions fails. All right, installation on Linux. Pretty straightforward. Not too elaborate. If you're running Debian or any Debian-based distro and you have root access, apt-get install MySQL Server, pulls it down, installs it, sets it up, starts the daemon. Gen 2, I'm told it's emerge MySQL. I don't run Gen 2, so I don't know.
That's it.
Huh? That's it?
Perfect.
Red Hat and Fedora, if you're running Yum on your Red Hat Fedora box, Yum install MySQL, or you can download the RPM files directly from mysql.com. Of the Linux distributions, RPM is the only format that they provide precompiled binaries for. But you can run MySQL on a ton of platforms. If you're running Solaris, if you're running Windows, if you're running, it'll even support versions of NetWare 6.5 or above. It'll support QNX, if anybody's used that. So there's tons of support. Once you're installed, the next thing you have to think about is some initial security problems. And let me bring up a window for this. When MySQL is first installed, with the exception of Windows, there's no default root password. So as soon as you set up that system, anybody who has access to your computer that's running on can log in as root of the MySQL system, not root of your user system, and run applications or do whatever they want in the database. So the first command you should always type when you create your server is MySQL admin, which is the admin tool for MySQL, the command line admin. You type in U for the -U for the user, and this user we're worried about is root, and password. Now you can type password dash. Can everybody see that, by the way? All right. Password dash and enter your new password. That's not the preferred way to do it, because if you do it that way, if anybody does a PS and lists the processes that are running, they'll be able to read what the new password is for that half second that it's doing the install. So if you leave password blank and just hit enter, it will prompt you for the new password, and it's interactive. I do it now, but I've already set the root password, so it won't let me do it. Once the root password is set, what I read out there preparing for this is that a lot of people recommend that you change the username of the root account for MySQL from root to another name. Unlike Unix or Linux, it doesn't require the main user to have the username root. So you can change it to Bill or Tom. What people recommend you do that for is so that if your SQL server is exposed to other applications or other servers, maybe it's out on the internet for whatever reason, anybody trying to brute force your server or who has a script or some other exploit out there that depends on the username root won't know what your account username is. And what you can, so let me log into MySQL, and I haven't done that yet too. Logging into the system, I'll skip ahead. MySQL has a command line tool called MySQL. Log in with MySQL, -U for means user, type in the user you want to log in as, and -P for password. Once again, you can do password dash my password, but then if you did that and your command line session runs for 10, 20, 30 minutes, however long you're in there, anybody can read your password from the PS listing, so don't do that. So user password enter, MySQL asks you what your password is, and let's hope I remember. All right, so I've logged in, says you're connected, and this is the MySQL command prompt right down here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change the name of the user account. Oh, I can't copy this. Okay. Update user.
What do we need to switch the database?
You can, well,
Or are you going to get MySQL database?
yeah, you can, that's a good point. Once you've logged into SQL, you're just there, but you're not, it doesn't know which database you want to use. So if you started typing command to execute or to select some data, and you hadn't told it what database you want to use, it's going to get like a select star from artists. It tells me that no database is selected. So what I can do is if I can show databases, command, yeah. So I do a command type show databases, and it'll show all the different databases that I've created. Now a database houses all of your tables. So a lot of people who, I work at the hospital, and we have a lot of users who think they have databases, which are large Excel spreadsheets. So a database is a collection of tables, indexes, everything tied to that particular usage for that database. So we're going to go ahead and if we say use MySQL, now it says that database says that the database has changed, and we are now using MySQL. So if I were to select user, select user from user. All right. So just write an SQL statement, which is a select statement that's I'm asking SQL, the database, to select the column user from the table called user and show me what's there. So we have we have 6 users defined. You'll notice that root shows up twice. The way MySQL does its security, it's not based solely on the username. It's based on the username and the host that it's connecting from. So if you have a computer named Bart and you have a computer named Ted on your network, or a computer with an IP address of whatever, you can have 2 different users named home user at Bart and home user at Ted, there would be two different users in the system. So the user tables are a little bit more difficult to maintain in MySQL, a little bit harder to think about. So if I ran that query again and select user and host, so now you see why root I have root access from the host localhost, and then I have root access from a host called Flink, which is actually this computer also. So anyway, back to what I was talking about, which is a little bit of security. If we go and update to the SQL command user, and we want to set user equal to admin, where user is equal to root. You know how exciting this is for you. So boom. Now I have changed the root user account on this machine from being called user to being called admin. If I do another select, boom, now the username, which was root, is now admin. That way, anybody who's trying to connect to your computer is gonna have one less tool to use. Is that clear? Is there any questions about that? All right. Some applications create a sometimes when you some distributions when you install MySQL creates a blank user. It's really not a problem because you're not connecting with the username. When you try to connect with the username, it's not going to link up to the blank user. But it's always good to know which users are in your table, so you just delete the user where the username is blank. All right, so that's enough about initial security. Best thing you can remember out of this is to change your root password on the machine. Otherwise, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. All right. What I showed you earlier is connecting to the command line, doing all your interaction with MySQL. The command line is simply MySQL -u, the username. -p tells it you want to use a password, but not to ask you for that password until it's in interactive mode. -h and the host name will let you specify another host. But if there was another computer on here and I needed to connect to it, replace the computer name or IP address with that host name, and you're good to go, assuming you have access to that machine. Once you're in,
Hey, Jake, do you think you could enlarge the font a little bit and then turn the background to black on?
on white.
Yeah,
Oh.
probably be a little better with the contrast.
Edit. Current profile. What fonts?
It might be too big. I know maybe 14. That should be
Turn
good.
to regular or?
Regular, yeah.
Yeah. And background color. Effects.
Just say none.
Is that all right? Or black on white? Or white on black?
That's good.
It doesn't matter.
Alrighty. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All right, so connecting to MySQL now, just change the root user to admin. So
You locked yourself out of your own database.
all right, I'll go to my backup user then. Very interesting. Didn't work like that on my desktop machine.
Might have helped with the flush privileges. You know, sometimes when you change settings, you have to flash privilege.
Spell privileges.
LEDGES.
No, sorry. PRIVIL.
PRIVIL.
EGES.
There you go.
Ah,
Let's see if that works.
Hi, Chad.
Thank you.
boom.
Flush privileges. Reset the user access.
You guys can sit up here if you want.
We got plenty.
Alrighty, so now that most of that's out of the way, let's talk a little bit about SQL. SQL is, like I said, the tool that you use to interact with MySQL. If you're not familiar with SQL and you want to use, if you're not familiar with the language SQL and you want to use the database server, MySQL, or any other database server, you're gonna eventually reach a point where you're not going to be able to do much more. Knowledge of SQL is fundamental for any database application server you're running. SQL syntax breaks down into, well, we're talking about 4 types here. Data retrieval, data manipulation, data definition, and data control. Data retrieval is simply pulling data from the system. So use music. Select star, or select artist. Alright, so there's a list of a bunch of albums and artists that I have in my music collection. So the select query is really the core of what select and the insert update is what you use 90% of the time you're using SQL. 90% of the time using MySQL server. Data manipulation is inserting, updating, or deleting rows. Inside your tables, you have them structured in such a way. You're going to want to insert more data into the table. If you're running a website that does a discussion board, every time someone goes in and adds another bit of their comments to the running dialogue, most likely that's being inserted into a table somewhere on some computer somewhere and being stored. Next time someone visits that web page and wants to know your opinion on the topics of the world, select statement is fired off and it's put into your web browser. Parsed, and then the HTML is sent back. Updates rows. So say you have a user table with the name, access name root. We ran the update table, the update command, and we want to change one piece of data from one thing to something else. Deletes rows. You have a user who's at your organization, and they leave, they go somewhere else, they get a better job, they win the lottery, they get hit by a bus, whatever. And you don't want them in there anymore. Delete, and that's how you specify it in SQL. Data definition, create and drop. Create and drop are used to create the tables in your databases. They're used to create the databases themselves. And then drop is used to remove them. Data control, grant, and revoke, used to give user privileges or remove them from the tables you've defined in your databases. So let's do some real quick. Let's create a database. What do we want to store information on?
If you delete, you have to be careful with delete because you've got linked tables, it can cause the problem.
Oh, depending upon your server, yeah. if your database is relational and it's really done up well and you have information linked, some servers won't let you delete data that's linked from one table to another. MySQL by default will let you do that, which can be problematic. So you have a you have a table that has all the songs that are on a CD, and then you have another table that has the list of CDs. If you delete the CD name from the list of CDs table, but you leave the songs in there, and then suddenly there's all these records in your songs table that don't have anything to link back to.
So would those then be considered orphan?
Those would be orphaned records, yeah. That's
But you guys want to avoid that?
yeah, that's not good.
No.
When half your data disappears.
The other problem that happens is also is that, let's say you have a list of customers, okay? And you want to maintain history. The customer's no longer a customer, but maybe it's a customer 2 years ago.
Mhm.
You really want to keep those records.
Oh, absolutely.
So what's more appropriate is usually a status key.
Certainly.
Okay? A status field in your database where you change it from an active status to a deleted status. And you still have the records, and you can always do a report on those records.
Sure. And you can
the
configure
statistics
your
are still there.
you can configure your interface to
To
by
only
default
show
only
you-
show active
Only
users.
show you active users.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Just,
Yeah, just going over that there is a delete command and you can delete records,
but.
but be careful with it.
Yeah.
Can you recover easily?
No?
Can you recover easily?
Well, no. If you depending upon how your data is stored, but realistically on some live system, if you delete, boom, it's gone. Bye bye. Now you do hopefully have backups. And you can restore from your backups, but then potentially you lose what you've done that day, or the whole system has to come down when you restore from last night's backups, and then step the server through each data change as it comes along. So it can be cumbersome. Be cautious. Huh?
And it may not work sometimes.
Well, yeah, oh, definitely.
When you need.
Be cautious with, and on the same vein, be cautious with your update statements too. Basically, any of your data manipulation, you can do some damage. Your select statements, depending upon how you write them, could give you erroneous data. I mean, you could write a select query that makes you think you have $100,000 in your bank when you have less. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's not unrecoverable. There's a lot of stuff with data manipulation that is. So, use that cautiously. All right, so let's go about creating let's create a table to store my, I don't know.
About fruit.
Fruit. All right. We have fruit in our fridge, and we want to know what kind we have. First thing to do is to create the actual database that's going to house all your tables. So create database.
Darn laptop keyboards.
Fruit DB. Oh. In SQL, or MySQL server, the command line doesn't believe that its job's finished until it gets a semicolon. So, which is nice because then you can create multiple line syntax without and not have it execute until you're ready, but it won't execute until you use the semicolon. So now we have this database called FruitDB. If we show, this is, cool. Now FruitDB is in there. We could create a user. So maybe our fruit database is going to be a web-based application that's going to know how much fruit we have and what fruit we need to buy, etc. But we're going to have a web application connect to it. You don't want one web application to have access rights to another web-based application that it has no business having access rights to. So, for example, if you have an application that runs your bulletin board system, and then you've created a fruit database, your bulletin board database doesn't necessarily need to know about your fruit database. Use 2 different users and 2 different passwords to allow PHP or whatever application is your web front end to connect to that data store. So let's see. Refresh my, type this right, refresh my. All right, so we're going to grant using the data control language. So we're going to grant, and it's always in the format of grant, and this is where I ran out of slides. So sorry. You're going to grant privileges to objects. So we're going to grant all access to fruit DB on fruit DB to fruit user. All right. And then we need to give fruit user a password identified by all right. So it went through. Now we have a user named fruit user with the password fruit password, and he has access to fruit DB. So use fruit DB. Now in there, now we can create a table. This is what do we want to store? We want to store the name of the fruit that we're going to use. We want to store I don't know how many of them we have in stock. Before I go further, let me say that this first table we're going to create isn't your fundamental standardized table. It's not. You're not going to have relationships. It's going to be a single table for the express purpose of showing you how to create a table in the database. Data normalization. Talk about it a little bit later,
Flat.
if we get to it at all.
Flat table.
Yeah, just a simple flat table. So we're going to use the create table command. Actually, let me clear this. Oh, never mind. Create table, and we're going to call it fruit. I don't know. Fruit table. All right. Your basic create table syntax. Create. What are you going to create as a table? And what it's going to be called is fruit database. When you do an open paren, or fruit table, excuse me, fruit TV. And then we create our columns. Fruit name. What type of data we want to store there, whether it's numeric data, whether it's character data. We can store binary objects, so potentially we could store pictures of the fruit actually in the database. Just a side note, storing binary data in the database makes it get really big and really slow, but it can be done.
Bitmaps.
Huh? So we're going to name the field we want, and we're going to give it a character data, varchar, and we're going to say it can be a maximum of, I don't know, 25 characters long. Throw in a comma, we can go to our next, I don't know, on hand, and we can make that an integer, and, location, that'll work. Location, and we're going to make that another, we can, varchar of, I don't know, 50 characters. Close parenthesis, semicolon, bam. So now we have the table in the database. We show tables. FruitDB. Another nice command if you want to know what your table is, how it's designed. Describe table or describe fruit TV. F-R-U-I-T. And it will tell us that we have a field. The field's name is fruit name. What type of field it is, whether it allows nulls, which are no data, and by default that's set up to yes. And the default value in the table is null. So if I were to insert into fruit table fruit name values apple. It inserts it in there. Now if we go select star from, star is a wildcard character, it means everything. From fruit, R-U-I, fruit.
You can do tab completion, huh?
Yeah. So if we do fruit, db dot fruit. Boom. Now we have our row in the table. Our first row is apple. It has a null value and on-handling location, but we can insert null values.
Just one,
Yeah.
one of the things you're doing well is naming things. So
Mhm.
you name tables and
Self-describing.
Some people call, like, you know, you go to
Table
a
one.
database and be like TLC,
Yeah.
you know, and you're like, well, what the hell is this?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
It's a good thing to name things right.
With programming, database creation, even the stuff you put in your directories, documents you write, naming is key. Have your objects describe themselves to anybody who may come upon them as efficiently as possible. So don't just call field 1 FLD1 or field 2 FLD2, because as soon as you win the lottery or get hit by a bus, I've already used that joke, the next person who comes in has to maintain your code is going to go, what in the hell goes into field XY439? You know, assuming that there's nothing that does that. So describe your databases, describe your tables, make them as understandable as possible. Same thing in your code. If you're a programmer and you're making variables, X and Y, not the best names for variables, you know.
I want to kill people that do that. I come in to clean up code and there's a variable that's like AAAHH. What does that mean?
Or they do like the QWERY.
Yeah, quirky. Yeah. So if you have something that's going to hold, I don't know, database name, call it DB name, or something that's self-describing. So we created this table. I've inserted some data into it. That's all well and good, and working on the command line interfaces is okay. For all you assembly language programmers out there who really, I work 90% of, well, not 90%. When I do SQL, probably 70% of it is done at the command line. I'll prototype a statement using whatever graphical designer I have. And I'll view it in text mode and really customize it myself. But there is hope for those of us who don't want to do that.
All this is good for automating stuff. Like if you write Perl or PHP and like for loops and stuff like that, is you need to know the syntax
Yes,
that you're showing there in order to make things work the way you want them to. Right?
absolutely. But we have a tool that is nice, which is called PHP MyAdmin. It's a PHP-based application that runs on it'll run on, I think there's a Win32 port, a port of it for IIS, as long as you have PHP support. So you have to have Apache for There's not native PHP support for IIS, is there?
Oh, there is.
There is.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So it should run on there. So, propose PHP MyAdmin. All right, so here we have a web server running on the laptop. By default, when you install this application, it's configured to look for a server, a MySQL server on your local machine. You can configure it to work with machines across the network as well. Ask you for your login and password. Go ahead and log in. And present you with a nice interface to be able to interact with your data. Column on the side, you can select, so we'll look at FruitDB. It'll list all the databases in your table, or all the databases that that user has access to.
All right.
Show you the tables in there. We have a table called Fruit Table. We can run some SQL on that table if we want to. Click on the SQL tab, and we can actually enter the SQL here and execute it against the server, which is really nice if you want to do some really quick statements, or you don't want to get on the command line, or you only have a web interface. You can go back to the structure of the database, grab the table, you can describe what the table looks like, you can browse what information is in the table. So it'll pull back the top 30 rows and put that data down here. If there was more data in the table, it would show that. Let me show you a bigger database. I have my music database. Created a little Perl script that went through and pulled all the ID3 tags off of all my MP3s so that I could do something with them later. So let's browse the albums table. So this will show me in rows of 30, records of 30, or however much I define. If I want to see 50 tables, it'll show me. Show you what data is in there. You can go ahead and edit the data directly.
Depending on your application, that could be very bad.
Yeah. No, I mean, using if you're setting up MySQL to use with some web-based application, and you're pretty confident about how that thing's set up, it's PHP My Bulletin Board or PHP BB, anything out there like that, you're not going to really want to fuss with the tables. But if you're creating your own application, you need to create your table structure in the beginning, or somehow bad data got into your database and you don't want to have to, I don't know, go to the command line. You can just pull and change the individual pieces of data. So if this was misspelled because the ID3 tag was misspelled, I could change, the artist or whatever, and go, and now it'll put my data back into the table. Turn back there, and now we'll see that 11 has now been appended to the end of that row. And delete records, it's a very useful tool, and it's a lot quicker and easier than running around on the command line, especially for the display of data. If I were to select star from music albums, that's not very useful. You can only show you can only see a little bit at a time. You can scroll back up.
Now the music.albums thing, is that a shortcut for
I'm sorry.
actually selecting or just going down the database to table name and stuff?
The SQL standard defines, I think, 4 levels: server, database, table, and column for the structure of your information. So potentially, if MySQL permitted it, if there were 2 SQL servers talking to each other, I could type in select star from server name dot database dot table, and I can even include the column if I wanted to get more specific to the information you're looking for. So what I did there is I had select star from music, which is the name of the database, and then albums, which is the name of the table. All right. So that MySQL admin is a useful tool for interacting with the data directly.
Now, I've read in a couple of books that, that we have this set up on your site or what have you, that you actually disable it. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well,
PHP MyAdmin.
As I said before, I'm not a server admin. I have it set up on my home network, but it doesn't face the outside world. The application, anything that comes in from my router, can't get access to that application, to PHP MyAdmin, because of those warnings. But for using it in a test environment, in a secure environment, it's a useful tool. As with any web application, someone's going to potentially find a flaw with it and exploit it. This one's a little bit more dangerous than others because it could potentially have access to every one of your databases, not just the database that that web application is associated with. But I don't know. I know people at the hospital use it to administer some of the smaller Unix.
A simple way to lock this down would just be putting setting it up so either on a different IP or a different network card, where this particular hosted site can only be accessed from, quote, an internal IP.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can, if they need access outside, they can set up a VPN. There are ways to lock it down so you're not wide open to the world.
That pretty much goes with any type of security.
Yeah.
So that's, excuse me, connecting the MySQL server from the command line, connecting the MySQL server using the PHP MySQL admin, PHP MyAdmin. And then I just have a real quick to show you. I wrote a real simple script that just connects, using PHP, connects to the database and pulls data from that list albums table. So using PHP. Now let me bring that up and show you briefly how PHP connects to MySQL databases. And this is by no means exhaustive. And there's a lot of good documentation out there on connecting to MySQL from PHP. I mean, that's the core of the LAMP database web-driven paradigm. All right, so here's a PHP script. It's really simple. Here's part of the key for connecting to the server using PHP. PHP, if you have what is it, the MySQL extensions?
If it's compiled.
If it's compiled into the application, into the web server, then use the MySQL connect call, pass it the host name, the username, and the password that you want to use to connect to the server with. So here, yes, my username and password are both Chad for this test. One thing as an aside, when you're using a really large application, PHP application, most of them that I've seen will have a connection, just a standalone piece of code in a standalone PHP file that has your connection information and then is readable only by the web server or only by the user that that application is running under, so that it's, you don't have to put your username and password in every table or every PHP page that connects to the server, so that if you change your username and password, you don't have to go to every individual PHP page and change your username and password. They'll usually use it as an include file, so they'll include login.php. Keep it on your server with a PHP extension. That way, if anybody figures out what your configuration file's name is, and they type it in, they're going to get a blank page because it's not designed to print any data back to the server. So right here we create the connection. We store it in a variable link or dive with a connect. Then we do MySQL select DB call, and we can pass it the server, or excuse me, the database we want to connect to. Perform the query, and write our SQL here. This is redundant because we already selected the database music, but just being specific, mymusic.albums. Return the results from the query to the results variable, and then output the results as HTML. Does a while loop, it goes through, it pulls down the array, and it'll prints a real basic HTML table to describe the data. Core concepts here are the how to connect using PHP, and then setting up your query, getting your results, and then the fetch array. You can do fetch line. There's another fetch. You can fetch a discrete the next discrete value using PHP, but I am far and away from being a PHP guru, or that much of a user actually. Most of the stuff I write for work is in started SQL or ASP. But that's just a real simple look at connecting to the server, pulling back data, and displaying it. Just have one more thing to talk about really, which is backups. So you have your data in your table and you've created your tables. You've become familiar with the SQL language so you can create whatever sort of data you want. Now we got to make sure that it's safe. Or maybe we want to take the data from one location, put it on CD, and import it in another location. MySQL has a feature called MySQL. It's got two backup utilities. One's called MySQL dump, which is designed to be used maybe when the database isn't being used highly. If you have a large database, MySQL dump can take a while to dump all your data into a file.
Does that lock the records so that there can't be any changes done while it's doing the
It
dump?
does table and row level locking, but there can be, I believe, if you lock one row and pull that data down, and then no one can change it while you're pulling it off, they can change it right after. So, and then there's MySQL hot, what's it, hot read? Hot backup? Hot copy. MySQL hot copy does dirty reads, and it'll just pull everything that you have as it sits. And you can control the level of dirty reads, I'm sorry. In a database, if someone's in the middle of updating a row, and you read data from that row, that's called a dirty read, because it's not where it was supposed, it's not in a finalized state. So that's potentially bad. So if you back up your database with dirty data in it, and you restore it, you can have potential problems. And you can control the level of whether or not you want to allow MySQL hot copy to do dirty reads. Read the man page. But let me just do a real quick MySQL dump. MySQL. Dump and its usages. MySQL dump database. Let's dump the music database. And output to didn't type my password. Which is going to be all right, so what we see here is,
You pipe it out to a file, right?
yeah, you pipe it out to a file name. So caret output.txt, it runs. And then if we look at output.txt, the way MySQL dump works is it actually takes the data that's in your database and creates a series of SQL statements so that you can take this table, take this file, bring it to an SQL server, import the file, it'll read each statement, and basically it'll create the table out. If the table exists, it'll drop it and replace it. It'll read each one of these SQL statements and pull out all the data. So, but it had a problem. Yeah, that I'm missing data from my tables. But that's the file that comes out. Basically just your SQL syntax. One other thing, when starting up SQL Server, you can start up using a binary log file. And what that'll do is it'll take your data, anytime there's statement that's run that adjusts, that modifies table in your database, it'll write that entry to a log file so that if during the day your server crashes, you can back up from the previous night's logs and then roll forward every data change you've had since your last backup up to the point where your database was failed. So anyway, that's pretty much the end of what I have to say about MySQL. I hope it was useful on some cursory level to kind of give you an introduction into what you can do with the system. If you really want to use MySQL, I really strongly recommend that you learn the SQL syntax SQL. It makes your life significantly easier once you know how to get at your data. Yeah, I don't think I'll drag on about normalization of tables, but anyway. Thank you very much.
Anything else that you recommend for someone that does want to pursue?
Books.
Read. MySQL, there's two basic versions that are out there right now. The MySQL 4 tree, which is they're just doing maintenance on right now, I believe, and the MySQL 5 tree. MySQL 5 is much more feature complete than MySQL 4. It's a lot more robust, and they've made it, which is a standard database connectivity, to the MySQL server and model all of your relationships inside Access. I have yet to see, honestly, an open source tool that'll do that modeling. Does anybody have any suggestions as to one? Because it's really nice. You put it together, it creates all your joins, and then you can jump to the text and really get down there and customize what you want.
And you can test them and see if it works.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because doing something like that, creating relationships with your tables and so forth, would be, in my opinion, maybe nightmarish if you're doing it all from the command line, because that would be really rough.
Well, and MySQL 5 now supports foreign keys. Originally in MySQL 4, at least up until 4.09, it didn't support the foreign key feature, so that MySQL didn't know what the linked tables were. That was kind of left up to at the application level. 5 now supports it, so you can say this is a foreign key from this table, and then it will kind of create I assume, when you do join queries from them, it will be a little more sensitive to that. But really, knowing your SQL syntax is key.
Chuck, have you tried with new OpenOffice 2.0? They actually have a database connection. Have you tried that?
I've tried it, and it crashed on me 3 times. Now I was using the Win32 port at work, but it's dog slow, and I don't know how well it's if it even has a graphical query designer. I couldn't get that far.
I know that I was playing through it and I was like, oh, database connection, because that's one thing that everybody says, oh, I use OpenOffice, but it doesn't have a good database connection. And
Yeah.
I noticed in the 2.0 they actually incorporate that into it.
As far as I'm concerned, that's one of the key areas that open source lacks in, is a real good open source data modeling and administration tool. Any other questions? Thanks for, oh yes,
Well, you could have mentioned primary keys perhaps.
pardon me?
Primary keys, but you said,
Yeah, and indexing in primary, and I tried to make it an introduction to the actual server part of using it, knowing the basic structure to get into the table, create databases, create tables. Real database development and creating keys is better, I think, served by a talk on data. And I didn't tailor that way. But I'd love to talk to anybody about it. I mean, that's what I do all day. So, thanks for bearing with me in my first presentation. I hope to get better and a little funnier and a little less dry. But if you have any questions or if there's anything I may be able to help you with, let me know. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.